Good evening, everyone. Welcome back to the Catholic Men's Podcast, helping you find good works of literature for the Catholic gentleman. Why don't you join me by my campfire for my special live stream called Catholic Insomniacs, Tales to Fall Asleep To, which I hope will be a good resource for those like myself who have an overly active mind at night. This time I'll be going over some amazing listener-submitted stories of miracles and apparitions of Our Lady. These are all approved by the Catholic Church. If you'd like to submit a story of your own, please check out the link in the description below, or just simply write it in the comments section. Be sure to submit the idea in its entirety with the appropriate sources, and keep in mind that I'm looking for actual stories. The first story is about one of the earliest recorded apparitions of Our Lady in a vision of St. Gregory the Wonder-worker, sometime in the mid-200s AD. Gregory Thaumaturgus, his title meaning the Wonder-worker, was born around 213 AD in Neo-Caesarea of Pontus, modern Turkey, into a prominent pagan family. Originally named Theodore, he received the Christian name Gregory at baptism. As a young man, he intended to study law, but instead encountered the renowned Christian teacher Origen in Caesarea of Palestine. Enchanted by Origen's wisdom, Gregory remained with him for 5 years, immersing himself in philosophy and scripture. Returning to his native city, he was consecrated bishop of Neo-Caesarea by Phaedimus, bishop of Amasea, at a time when the region had only a handful of Christians, and pagan worship dominated the city. Although hesitant at first, fearing that priestly duties might distract from his contemplative pursuits, Gregory accepted the episcopate under divine guidance, committing himself to the instruction and spiritual care of his people. Early on in his episcopate, Gregory experienced a vision of the Virgin Mary and St. John the Evangelist. This vision conveyed a divine revelation to him, a brief creed affirming belief in the Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. The vision impressed upon Gregory the importance of proclaiming true faith in the midst of widespread paganism, and led him to perform an act of radical defiance in the satanic pagan temple afterwards. The account of this miraculous encounter is preserved in a panegyric, a speech of praise written about a century later by, confusingly, another Saint Gregory, Gregory of Nyssa, to honor the life and authority of Gregory Thaumaturgus, and to preserve the Church's memory of his teachings. The ancient text reads as follows. At night he beheld the foundation of the faith. Various thoughts troubled him, for certain people perverted true teaching and often obscured it through persuasive, clever attempts. As he lay awake, there appeared to him in a vision an aged person in human form, adorned with solemn raiment, whose countenance was striking by great virtue and kindness, in addition to the integrity of his form. Gregory was struck by fear at this sight, and, rising up from bed, realized who he was and why he came. After quieting his fear, he said in a soft voice that a divine order bade him to appear, the reasons of which were obscure to Gregory, in order to reveal the truth of correct belief and to encourage him to speak while gazing upon him with both joy and respect. Then the old man suddenly extended his hand, and with his finger pointed to something which appeared near him, a splendid female form. Once again Gregory was terrified and turned his face away, unable to bear its sight. The vision was especially amazing since the night was gloomy, for it resembled something like a light illuminated by another light. Since he could not look upon this spectacle, he heard from those who appeared to him speaking in detail about what he was seeking. Not only was he revered with regard to true knowledge of faith, but recognized the names of each man who appeared when they called each other by their respective names. It is claimed that this vision of a female form told Gregory that the evangelist John was exhorted to manifest the mystery of truth to a young man, saying that she was chosen to be the mother of the Lord, whom she cherished. He also said that this fitting vision had vanished again from his sight. He was immediately ordered to write down this divine revelation and later proclaim it in the church. In this way it became for others a divinely given legacy through which the people might repulse any evil of heresy. The words of that revelation are as follows: One God, Father of the living Word, who consists of wisdom, power, and who is the eternal pattern, perfect begetter of who is perfect, Father of the only begotten Son. One Lord, alone from him who is alone, God from God, pattern and image of the divinity, mighty Word, wisdom which encompasses everything, true Son of true Father, unseen Son of the unseen Father, immortal Son of the immortal Father, and eternal Son of the eternal Father. One Holy Spirit, whose life is from God, and who is made manifest through the Son, as well as to men, perfect image of the perfect Son, living source of those who are alive, holy provider of sanctity, in whom God the Father appeared, who is above all and in all, and God the Son, who is in all. Perfect Trinity, to whom belongs glory, eternity, and kingship, which can never change. So ended the message. Thus the Trinity is not created, nor has anything else which claims to be first, nor is there anything which exists that can be introduced later. Similarly, the Son neither lacks the Father, nor does the Spirit lack the Son. Rather, the Trinity forever remains immutable and constant. After that vision had filled him with confidence and courage, much like an athlete who competes in a contest after having acquired stamina from a trainer, he stripped himself for the stadium and prepared for the struggle. In similar fashion, so does Gregory exercise himself, and the assistance of grace which appeared to him anoints his soul and makes it worthy to undergo the contest. After leaving his solitude, Gregory at once hastened to the city, where he felt obliged to establish a church for God. He knew that the whole region was under the grip of demons, and that the temple of the true God was not yet constructed. The entire city and surrounding area was filled with pagan altars, sacred places, and all the people were devoted to images. Upon arriving in the city at evening from the countryside, a violent rainstorm forced Gregory into the temple. This place was renowned because one of the demons revered there was accustomed to manifest himself to the temple's custodians, and a certain prophet was empowered to utter oracles. Once Gregory entered the temple with several companions, one of the demons was petrified at the invocation of Christ's name. Having purified the air with the figure of the cross which had been defiled, he spent the entire night in prayer and singing hymns according to his usual custom. In this way, Gregory transformed the place into a temple of prayer, which had been profaned by unclean sacrifices and images. When day came and the attendants of that temple gathered, they saw that the altar, the idol, and all the sacred precinct had been purified by Gregory's prayer. They were astonished, especially those who were accustomed to hear the demon's voice. He himself was gone, struck dumb by the invocation of Christ's name. Thus the place which had been consecrated to false gods was from that day forward made fit for the true God. It's a truly incredible story, and I found it on a website called Lectio Divina, and I'll be putting a link to it in the description of this episode. Please say a prayer for Brother Richard McCambly, who runs that website and is undergoing cancer treatment. On to the next listener-submitted story. The Miracle Healing of Ignatius Strecker. I will tell a story that is the only Vatican-approved miracle in the entirety of the Midwest of the USA. I don't desire to be given credit or anything else for this story. Rather, I would appreciate it if you prayed for all the souls of aborted fetuses and the mothers. Before I start, however, I would like to point out that this is a rather recent miracle, past 200 years. I am also related to the person who was miraculously healed, for he was my 7th great-grandpa. I'll be careful to tell this story as it was passed to my family and how it was eventually passed to me, as well as to try to the best of my ability to keep this factually correct according to what was affirmed by the Church. Our story begins in 1864 with a 46-year-old German immigrant, his 9 children, and his wife, all in the bustling town of St. Louis, Missouri. One day, while Ignatius Strecker was at his job in the soap factory, he managed to hurt himself. According to my family, he was moving a metal slider that was used to transport lard that would be used in soap. He managed to slam this slider into his chest, causing blunt force trauma. The initial injury wasn't that bad, just slight swelling and a burning feeling in the chest. This burning feeling would last 2 months, up until it started to get much worse. The inflammation grew, the infection spread. Pockets of oozing pus was forming inside his body, making it hard to breathe. The inflammation didn't seem to be slowing the spreading either. The infection was spreading, and it was moving fast. Upon reaching this point, they called a doctor who tried many, many different medicines. He spent the next 9 months bedbound until they had to cut him open so as to see what may be happening on the inside. And just to spare you some of the gory details, he was pretty much already dying. It did not look good, and they noticed tuberculosis. Upon stitching him up, they gave him no more than 3 weeks of life. However, he didn't die. He spent the next 2 months suffering with no hope for being cured. It was about that time that a certain priest was passing through St. Louis, carrying a bone belonging to St. Peter Claver. Upon hearing the news that the priest would be coming to town with the remains of one of Christ's faithful, Mrs. Steckler decided to pull Mr. Steckler out of bed to go to the priest at St. Joseph's Church to get blessed with the remains of St. Peter Claver. Upon kissing the remains of Peter and receiving the Blessed Sacrament of the Eucharist, Ignatius felt a rush of strength, and his inflammation started to disappear. After being bedbound for almost a full year, Ignatius would return to work at the soap factory the day after kissing the relic and receiving the most holy Blessed Sacrament, and all symptoms and signs of any sickness gone within 2 weeks. Ignatius Strecker would go on to live a good life, dying some 30-something years later in his 80s. This miracle would be recognized by Rome in 1887 by Cardinal Bianchi. St. Peter Claver was canonized the following year, with his name being on the Roman calendar, remembered on September 9th. This next story was actually recommended to me by my sister and is about an incredible Lourdes miracle. I found the source for the healing of Jack Traynor on faithandfamily.org.uk. I Met a Miracle. The story of Jack Traynor by the Reverend Patrick O'Connor, missionary of St. Columban. On Friday morning, September 10th, 1937, I came face to face with a miracle. The meeting place was a bustling railway station in France. There was no mistaking the miracle, as with the weight and strength of 16 stone of burly humanity, it helped me to fight my way onto a crowded train. The name of the miracle was John Traynor. I first beheld him as I came along the platform with my suitcase and saw him waiting to board the coach in which I hoped to ride. A powerfully built man, about 5 feet 10 in height, with a strong, wholesome, ruddy face, dressed in a rather rumpled gray suit, carrying his traveling bag. He stood out from the surrounding crowd. 2 of his little boys were with him, and 8 or 10 Irish and English pilgrims on their way home from Lourdes. Now, John Traynor was a miracle because, by all laws of nature, he shouldn't have been standing there hefty and healthy. He should have been, if alive at all, paralyzed, epileptic, a mass of sores, shrunken with a shriveled, useless right arm and a gaping hole in his skull. That's what he had been. That's the way medical science had certified that he must remain. Only a miracle could cure him. A miracle did. I rode with him for about 10 hours in the train that day, and when I said goodbye to him in Paris that evening, it was with the certainty that I could never forget him. He was a delightful character, this big Liverpool Irishman with his manly faith and piety, lacking all trace of exaggeration in one direction or the other, unaffected and unassuming, yet obviously a fearless militant Catholic with only a primary education, but with a clear mind, enriched by the faith and preserved by a great honesty of life. Not for his personality, however, am I bound to remember him, but for his story, which he told me on our long journey that day. He told it simply, soberly, exactly, a narrative that it was a grace to hear and is a duty to recall. Afterwards, I wrote it down and sent my version back to him for checking. Painstakingly, with the aid of Mr. John Murray, the old schoolmaster who had taught him as a boy in St. Patrick's School, he went over the manuscript, correcting, filling in gaps, adding details. I had the files of the Liverpool newspapers searched to find the corroborative evidence of their reports. I obtained copies of newspaper photographs taken at the time of the miracle. I read the official reports signed by 6 doctors, 4 English, 1 French, and 1 Belgian, and issued by the Medical Bureau in Lourdes when more than 3 years had elapsed to allow for careful examination of all the evidence and to establish the permanence of the cure. And now, here's the story of John Traynor. He was born and reared in Liverpool. His Irish mother died when he was still quite young, but her faith, her devotion to Mass and Holy Communion, and her trust in the Blessed Mother stayed with him as a memory and a fruitful example. She was a daily communicant when few people were, he told me. The First World War broke out in 1914, and Jack Traynor was mobilized with the Royal Naval Reserve, to which he belonged. He was in the Naval Brigade that took part in the unsuccessful Antwerp expedition of October 1914, and was in the last battalion to retreat. He was carrying one of his officers to safety when he was hit on the head by shrapnel. He didn't regain consciousness until 5 weeks later when he woke up after an operation in a marine hospital in England. He recovered rapidly and went back into service. In 1915, lent to the 1st Dublin Fusiliers as physical instructor, he was a member of the expeditionary force sent to Egypt and the Dardanelles. On April 25, 1915, he took part in the landing from the steamship River Clyde at Gallipoli. He was in charge of the first boat to leave the ship and was one of the few to reach the shore that day. From their positions in the steep banks above the beach, the Turks raked the Clyde and the boats with deadly gunfire. The casualties were so heavy that the operation was suspended until nightfall. Meanwhile, all the officers in the landing parties had been killed, and Traynor found himself in charge of about 100 men who took cover in a shallow trench. A Catholic chaplain, Father Finn, was killed in the second boat from which he fell. Traynor dragged him from under the barbed wire, and later he and his comrades buried him on the shore. After dusk, more officers and men landed, and the small force began to fight its way with severe losses up to the sandhills. For days, the bitter fighting continued. Traynor took part without injury until May 8th, when he was hit by machine gun fire during a bayonet charge. He seems to have been literally sprayed with bullets. He was wounded in the head and chest, while a bullet tore through the inner side of his upper right arm and lodged under the collarbone. Medical corpsmen brought him back, dazed and suffering, to the beach, and he was shipped to the base hospital at Alexandria, Egypt. Now began his long years as an invalid and as the patient of unsuccessful operations. A well-known English surgeon, Sir Frederick Treves, operated on him in Alexandria in an attempt to sew together the severed nerves in the upper arm, which the bullet wound had left paralyzed and useless. The attempt failed, and so did another, made by another surgeon, on the hospital ship that brought Traynor from Alexandria to England. In September 1915, in the Haslar Naval Hospital, England, a third operation was performed with the same object and the same result. While on the hospital ship, Traynor suffered his first epileptic attack. These attacks became frequent. The Surgeon General of the Navy now advised amputation of the paralyzed arm, as there seemed to be no hope of ever joining the torn and shrunken nerves. Traynor would not consent. In November 1916, another doctor tried to suture the nerves, bringing the number of unsuccessful operations up to 4. By this time, Traynor had been discharged from the service, first on 80% pension, then on 100% as being permanently and completely disabled. He had to spend months in various hospitals as an epileptic patient. In April 1920, a doctor realized that the epilepsy was probably the result of the head wounds and operated on the skull. Whether bits of shrapnel were found and removed isn't known, but we do know that the operation left Traynor with an open hole about an inch wide in his skull. A silver plate was inserted to shield the brain. The epileptic condition was no better after the operation. The fits were as frequent as 3 a day. Both legs were partly paralyzed, and nearly every organ in Traynor's body was impaired. An ambulance brought him back to Liverpool, where he lived with his wife and children in a house in Grafton Street. The Ministry of Pensions supplied him with a wheelchair. In this he would sit for hours outside the house. He had to be lifted from his bed into the chair and back again. The year 1923, the 8th after he became a casualty in Gallipoli, found him leading this helpless existence. I have counted the names of 10 doctors through whose hands he had passed up to then. The result of all their efforts and examinations was to prove that he was completely and incurably incapacitated. Unable to stand or walk, subject to frequent epileptic fits, with 3 open wounds, one of them in his head, without the power of feeling or movement in his torn and shriveled right arm, he was indeed a human wreck. Somebody arranged to have him admitted to the Mossley Hill Hospital for incurables on July 24, 1923, but by that date, Jack Traynor was to be in Lourdes. What follows is his own narrative as I wrote it down and as he checked it. I had always had a great devotion to Our Blessed Lady, having acquired it from my mother especially. I felt now that if Our Lady's shrine at Lourdes was in England, I would go there often, but it seemed to be a faraway place that I could never reach. In the month of July 1923, I was at home, helpless as usual, when a neighbor woman came into the house and spoke of an announcement that had been made in our parish. A Liverpool diocesan pilgrimage was being organized for Lourdes. It would cost £13 to go. A down payment of £1 would engage a place. My wife was out in the yard, and I called her in. I found afterwards that she had already heard about the pilgrimage, but had decided not to tell me, fearing that I'd want to go. I told her to go upstairs and get a certain box in which we kept a gold sovereign, which my brother had given me and which we were treasuring for some special emergency. She asked me what I wanted to do with it now. I said that I wanted to give it to Mrs. Cunningham, a neighbor, as a first payment on a ticket to Lourdes. My wife was very disturbed, but finally did as I told her, and the neighbor went off to make the booking for me. A few days later, one of the priests in charge of the pilgrimage came to see me. He was upset at the thought of my going and wanted me to cancel my booking. "You can't make the trip," he said. "You'll die on the way and bring trouble and grief to everybody." My answer was that I had made my first payment, I had booked my place, and I was going to Lourdes. After much talking, he said finally, "Well, you won't be allowed to travel unless the doctor gives his approval. If you get a medical certificate, we'll take you." Clearly, he seemed to think that it was impossible. I thought that my doctor would approve of the trip, but he refused. We called in several doctors, and every one of them said that it would be suicide. Later, when the Ministry of Pensions learned that I had gone to Lourdes, they protested very strongly. The priest came again to visit me and flung himself across my bed, begging me to give up the idea. I would not, and finally succeeded in going without any medical certificate. To raise the £12, the balance due on my ticket, we sold some of our belongings, and my wife pawned even her few bits of jewelry. By this time it had got around Liverpool that this crippled and paralyzed ex-serviceman wanted to go to Lourdes, and the papers began to write about it. I was the center of more attention than I liked. Everybody, with the exception of my wife and 1 or 2 relatives, told me I was crazy. The day for leaving Liverpool came. The pilgrims were to travel on 2 trains. It was a terrible task to prepare me. I hardly realized what the journey was, and I had nothing I could take with me except the few shillings left over after we had paid for the ticket. My wife lifted me out of bed, and my brother Frank got me into my invalid chair. There I remained while the others attended the 4 a.m. Mass at St. Malachi's. Then, rushed and excited and hoping to avoid public notice, they raced me down through all the back streets of Liverpool to get me to the station. At the station, there was a large crowd of pilgrims and their friends. Already my case was well known through the newspapers, and people began to fuss around us, making it still more difficult for me to get to the platform. I did reach it, just too late. The first train was about to leave. The priest director came up to me in great agitation and said, "Traynor, you're too late. We can't get you on the train now. In heaven's name, take this as a sign that you are not to come. You'll only die on the journey." I said, "Father, I've paid for my ticket to Lourdes, and I'm going to Lourdes." He said, "You'll die on the way." I said, "Then I'll die in a good cause." There was another train, and I said that they could put me in the coal tender or anywhere they liked as long as they put me on the train. By being obstinate about it, I won my point, was placed on the second train amid scenes of excitement and confusion, and began my journey to Lourdes. In 1923, arrangements for taking care of the sick on the English pilgrimages to Lourdes were not by any means as good as they were later on. The experience was very trying. I remember practically nothing of the journey, except seeing a number of sick people on stretchers beside me on platforms and docks, some of them bleeding, all of them suffering. I believe that I was very sick on the way. 3 times they tried to take me off the train in France to bring me to a hospital, as I seemed to be dying. Each time there was no hospital where they stopped, and the only thing to do was to go on again, with me still on board. We reached Lourdes on July 22nd, and I was transferred with the rest of the sick to the Asile Hospital in the domain of the grotto. I was in a terrible condition, as my wounds and sores had not been freshly bandaged since I left Liverpool. Meanwhile, a Protestant girl from Liverpool had come to the continent on a holiday tour. She got tired of all the usual show places and happened to come to Lourdes. She was a trained nurse, and seeing all the sick, she offered her services to help in the asile. Her parents in England, upset at her decision to stay as a volunteer worker in Lourdes, sent out her sister to keep her company. The 2 girls went down to see the Liverpool pilgrims. They remembered having seen me sitting in my wheelchair outside my house at home, and they volunteered to take care of me. I gladly accepted their kind offer, and they washed and dressed my sores and looked after me during my stay in Lourdes. Ours was a large pilgrimage comprising of about 1,200 people in all, including many priests headed by the late Archbishop Keating of Liverpool. We spent 6 days in Lourdes. During that time I was desperately ill. I had several hemorrhages as well as epileptic fits. In fact, one woman took it upon herself to write to my wife, saying that there was no hope for me and that I'd be buried in Lourdes. In spite of my condition, however, I succeeded in being bathed 9 times in the water from the grotto spring, and I was taken to the different devotions in which the sick could join. On the morning of the 2nd day, I had a bad epileptic fit as I was being wheeled to the baths. Blood flowed from my mouth, and the doctors were very much alarmed. As I came to, I could hear them saying, "Better take him back to the asile at once." I protested, saying, "No, you won't. I've come to be bathed, and I'm not going back." "You'll die in the bath," they told me. "Very well," I said. "If I do, I'll die in a good place." I put the brake on the wheelchair by holding the wheel with my good hand, the left one, and the volunteer stretcher bearers had to give in. They took me into the baths and bathed me in the usual way. I never had an epileptic fit after that. We were to leave on the morning of July 27th. This afternoon of July 25th came, and I seemed to be as bad as ever. Already preparations were being made for the return journey. A young Frenchman, Félix Dully, who used to come to the asile selling rosaries and medals, came into our ward, and the last few shillings I had I spent on the little religious souvenirs for my wife and children. Then it was time to get ready for the baths. I was wheeled down to wait my turn. There were many to be bathed, and we all wanted to be finished before the afternoon procession of the Blessed Sacrament, which began at 4 o'clock. My turn came, and when I was in the bath, my paralyzed legs became violently agitated. The volunteer stretcher bearers became alarmed once more, thinking that I was in another fit. I struggled to get to my feet, feeling that I could easily do so, and wondered why everybody seemed to be against me. When I was taken out of the bath, I cried from sheer weakness and exhaustion. The brancardier threw my clothes on hurriedly, put me back on the stretcher, and rushed me down to the square in front of the church to await the procession. Practically all the other sick were already lined up. I was the third last on the outside to the right as you faced the church. The procession came winding its way back, as usual, to the church, and at the end walked the Archbishop of Reims, carrying the Blessed Sacrament. He blessed the two ahead of me, came to me, made the sign of the cross with the monstrance, and moved on to the next. He had just passed by when I realized that a great change had taken place in me. My right arm, which had been dead since 1915, was violently agitated. I burst its bandages and blessed myself for the first time in years. I had no sudden pain that I can recall, and certainly had no vision. I simply realized that something momentous had happened. I attempted to rise from my stretcher, but the brancardiers were watching me. I suppose I had a bad name for my obstinacy. They held me down, and a doctor or a nurse gave me a hypo. Apparently they thought that I was hysterical and about to create a scene. Immediately after the final benediction, they rushed me back to the asile. I told them that I could walk and proved it by taking 7 steps. I was very tired and in pain. They put me back in bed and gave me another hypo after a while. Doctors Azurdia, Finn, and Marl certify that they examined Traynor on his return to the asile after the procession of the Blessed Sacrament. Apparently, this was to see if he could really walk, as he claimed. We find that he had recovered the voluntary use of his legs. The reflexes exist. There is intense venous congestion of both feet, which are very painful. The patient can walk with difficulty. They had me in a small ward on the ground floor. As I was such a troublesome case, they stationed brancardiers, or volunteers, in relays to watch me and keep me from doing anything foolish. Late that night, they placed a brancardier on guard outside the door of the ward. There were 2 other sick men in the room, including one who was blind. The effect of the hypos began to wear off during the night, but I had no full realization that I was cured. I was awake for most of the night. No lights were on. The chimes in the basilica rang the hours and half-hours as usual through the night, playing the air of the Lourdes Ave Maria. Early in the morning I heard them ringing, and it seemed to me that I fell asleep at the beginning of the Ave. It could have been a matter of only a few seconds, but at the last stroke I opened my eyes and jumped out of bed. First, I knelt on the floor to finish the rosary I had been saying. Then I dashed for the door, pushed aside the 2 brancardiers, and ran out into the passage and the open air. Previously, I had been watching the brancardiers and planning to evade them. I may say here that I had not walked since 1915, and my weight was down to 8 stone. So that was 8 years later. Dr. Marley was outside the door. When he saw the man over whom he had been watching during the pilgrimage and whose death he had expected push 2 brancardiers aside and run out of the ward, he fell back in amazement. Out in the open now, I ran towards the grotto, which is about 200 or 300 yards from the asile. This stretch of ground was graveled then, not paved, and I was barefoot. I ran the whole way to the grotto without getting the least mark or cut on my bare feet. The brancardiers were running after me, but they couldn't catch up with me. When they reached the grotto, there I was, on my knees, still in my nightclothes, praying to Our Lady and thanking her. All I knew was that I should thank her, and the grotto was the place to do it. The brancardiers stood back, afraid to touch me. The news was beginning to spread, even though it was still early in the morning. After I had prayed for about 20 minutes, I got up surprised and not pleased to find a crowd of people gathered around watching me. They drew aside to let me pass as I walked back toward the asile. That day was a nightmare of excitement and crowds. I was the center of attraction for all the people in Lourdes, it seemed to me. We left on the 9 o'clock train next morning, July 27th. I found that a first-class compartment had been set aside for me. I protested against taking it, but I had to give in. Early in the morning of July 27th, the 3 doctors examined Traynor before the pilgrimage left Lourdes. Their statement says that he can walk perfectly. He has recovered the use and function of his right arm. He has recovered sensation in his legs. The opening in his skull has diminished considerably. There have been no more epileptic crises. When Traynor took off the last of his bandages on returning from the grotto on the morning of July 26th, he found every one of his sores healed. I'm in the coal and haulage business now. I have 4 lorries or trucks and about a dozen men working for me. I work with them. I lift sacks of coal weighing around 200 pounds with the best of them, and I can do any other work that an able-bodied man can do. But officially, I'm still classified as 100% disabled and permanently incapacitated. I never accepted a penny from anybody at the time of my cure or after it. I came back from Lourdes penniless except for my way pension. I have never permitted any money to come to my family in connection with my cure or the publicity that has followed it. Nevertheless, Our Lady has improved my temporal affairs too, and thanks be to God and to her, I am now comfortably suited, and my children are well provided for. 3 of them have been born since my cure, 1 a girl whom I have named Bernadette. The 2 non-Catholic girls who looked after me when I came to Lourdes joined the church as the result of my cure. Their family at home in Liverpool followed their example, and so did the Anglican minister of the church they had been attending. I know of another parson who would like to follow suit, only that he's a married man with a family. A large number of conversions in Liverpool have resulted from the miracle. I go to Lourdes now every year and work as a brancardier there. I have gone twice and 3 times in 1 season. And it is here that Jack's testimony ends. Thank you all so much for listening. Sleep with the angels and rise with the saints. God bless you, and Our Lady keep you.